Hello and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Susan Guthrie, your host, and today is the third in our special series of episodes with Dr. Elizabeth Cohen, the divorce doctor. Welcome back, Dr. Elizabeth.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
I'm so happy you're here, and I can tell you my listeners are so happy you are here. So I just have to give a few accolades to Dr. Elizabeth. What you all don't know is her first show that she did for us 2 months ago, which was called The Divorce Doctor is in the House. Dealing with the emotions of divorce. That episode and became very quickly the number one divorce and beyond episode ever. It's my number one episode out of all. And then her second episode from just last month. So we're talking just 4 weeks ago, I think. The Perfect Storm, anxiety, depression, divorce, and COVID rocketed to the top 10 as well. And I think you're, as of this morning, at number 7. So clearly, what you have to say, which is no surprise to me, by the way, but clearly what you have to say and in the topics that we're talking about are striking a chord for people. So again, thank you for doing this series. It's been also wonderful because I'm getting outreach from listeners, as you know. So
Yeah.
one of the things, the topic that we've picked today, toxic masculinity, which we'll go into what that means, and I'll tell you right off the bat, everyone, I was wrong about what that meant. But this was actually occasioned by an email that I received from one of the listeners, who said, and Mark Worley, he said that it would be okay for me to use his name. So Mark, I want to thank you for writing this in. This episode is a direct result of your outreach. Mark said, "Hello, I want to say that the 2 episodes with Dr. Elizabeth Cohen have been very helpful for me as I embark on my own journey through divorce. My question for the next episode she's on is if she or you have any recommendations for programs similar to her Afterglow program, but that are either designed more toward men or are gender balanced. Most podcasts or programs I've looked for regarding divorce and men seem to be geared toward the transactional side of divorce and not with the emotions and mental health." And for me, huge bells go off because I've talked to Kate Anthony about this. Who said she's put programs out for men, but they just don't come.
Mm.
I've talked to a number of my guests about the fact that most of the people that come and reach out for help are women. But when
hmm
I did go to you, Elizabeth, you were like, "Oh, this is a topic. We need to talk about this." So let's dive in with just where I was wrong. You said toxic masculinity, and I wrote it down when we talked. And then I'm like, I had to Google it today to really understand. And then I went, oh, it's not what I thought it was. So what's your definition of toxic
hmm
masculinity?
Well, first, I just want to thank Mark for his vulnerability and willingness and openness to share his questions. So, thank you so much for that. And, Mark, your question is going to help so many people, women and men alike. So, thank you so much. And, Susan, I just want to commend you for being so connected to your audience that, of course, you create an episode when a listener asks a question.
Well, this is and I do want to say you just said it. This is going to help men and women. We need to understand this phenomena. And you and I just talked about that a minute ago, and we'll talk more about it.
Mhm.
But, let's start with that toxic
Yeah.
masculinity, because I don't know if Mark even knew that that's what he was describing in this world.
Yeah. So, toxic masculinity is similar to how we describe any sort of culturally acceptable way of being in the world and interacting with our environment. And it specifically refers to the messages that men are given that being emotional, being vulnerable, being open and sensitive is not masculine. It makes you weak and for some people feminine, and that if you have any of the more vulnerable emotional feelings, you are not man enough.
I think that phrase right there just kind of says it, right? You're not man enough, which implies that you have to be a certain type of man to be enough to I guess garner the positives in life. To have good things happen, you have to be a man. And
Exactly. And we
that starts
know
early,
it
right?
starts really early. And we know from the work that we do, Susan, that the more you push away any feeling, even if you look like you're okay on the outside, the inside, you're in so much pain. So it is our collective fault when we go out with a man and we say they don't know how to tell me how they feel, or they're always acting like everything's okay, or they don't know how to ask me questions. That's our culture's fault, not that man's fault. When our kids are little and a boy is crying, some people would actually use that really derogatory phrase, man up, but they would say, oh, there's nothing to cry about. They would call in the past, they would call them derogatory names of women,
Right.
meaning that they were sensitive, which we don't need to say on the podcast. So the idea is that vulnerability is seen as shameful for boys and men. And it is very, very subtle at times. And so people might not even know that they're doing this. But for example, if you look at toys for boys versus toys for girls, I never understood why there weren't dolls, baby dolls marketed for boys. If you go into a store, most of those baby dolls, first of all, are girls, and they're in pink, and they're clearly
Ruffles and
right. So
bows.
nurture, right, is for women, not for men. And that is wildly unfair to men and wildly unfair to women as well.
Right. Well, and that's actually one of the statistics that I found that goes to the harm that toxic masculinity causes is, there is harm to women that will flow from it. And we can talk about that, but it does hurt men as well. So the World Health Organization believes that risk taking behaviors and lack of willingness to seek help are among the most important reasons for higher rates of negative health outcomes for men. This includes ailments like heart disease, COPD, and other respiratory diseases, depression, and alcoholism. And men also experience shorter life expectancies compared to women.
Yes.
And they tie all of that to how we are socializing men to be tough guys, to not be vulnerable. And we do start that. We dress little boys in little baseball outfits and little lumberjack outfits, and we put little girls in little ballerina outfits, and we do say that man up. I've
Yeah.
heard people I know say that.
Right. And I think that when you it was so poignant to me just now when you talked about how men the health consequences of this toxic masculinity, because we've talked on other forums together about substance abuse. And substance abuse is simply someone trying to manage emotions. They're just doing it with alcohol and drugs because they don't know how to do it any other way. And if you are a man who has never been taught how to manage your feelings, and suddenly your wife up and leaves you, what are what are you supposed to do?
Right.
We haven't taught boys and young men coping strategies. There's something that happens. I know I have a teenage boy that when a boy sulks away, that's accepted as, oh, that's just how they are. They're going to go away and I don't know what, deal with their feelings on their own. Why are we thinking they're doing that? We're just allowing them to sulk away. Where maybe with a girl, people would be more likely to say, what's going on? What's happening for you? And that's just a completely biased approach because boys and men need us to care what's going on their insides too.
Right. Well, what is, I mean, think about it. You actually just used the example of a man, and it just brings me back to Mark, who wrote in,
Yeah,
who, men are socialized and go through this, it's not okay to have emotions. It's not okay to express them. It's not okay to be vulnerable. Then they find themselves at a time, ladies who are listening, think about how you're feeling going through divorce. There is no reason to believe that men are not having the same difficult emotions, yet we give them no way to deal
exactly.
with them.
Exactly. And I want to take full responsibility and kind of clean my side of the street that I am a part of this problem because I see only women in my program. And part of that is because I have grown up in that same toxic masculinity space. I had toxic masculine experiences and I didn't think men could be vulnerable until I actually started looking for it. And so I take full responsibility, Mark, that I am one of those people who might set you up to feel like you having a hard time during divorce is a problem because there's no programs for you. So I want to be really clear. The fact that there are not as many programs for you is not because you are wrong for how you're feeling, Mark. That's our culture's problem. And those of us who do this work, we really need to reckon with it. And you've really given me some, really important time to think about this, and I'm going to reflect on it. In my private practice, I can't tell you how many women come to me who, let's say, are dating and they tell me how they're feeling and their concerns about dating the new person after divorce. And then they start trying to hypothesize what the man might be thinking. This is in a heterosexual relationship. And honestly, almost every time I look at them and I say, you know that men come and sit on this couch and say the exact same things that you say. Like, they're not that different. They have feelings and emotions. And you should see these women's faces, Susan. They're like, really? I mean, it's shocking. And then we get into a conversation about toxic masculinity because it's so important.
Well, I think it's something that many of us just never get to the point of thinking about. We will rail against, for good reason, the patriarchy and, women not being able to break through the glass ceiling and lack of equality in our opportunities and being socialized to only be the nurturers or expected to be the nurturers and the breadwinners, whatever those things may be. But we have to realize that we have to give the opportunities to the masculine side and the men in the world as well, and understand the deficits that they're not deficits. That's absolutely the wrong word. The challenges that they're facing.
Mm-hmm.
And I, as a divorce attorney, I've had actually, I think, more male clients than female clients through the years. And this is when I was not mediating, when this is when I was representing clients. And I can tell you that because, if there are certain people I think men do become vulnerable to at some point in time, their therapist, but guess what? Their divorce attorney as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've always said, and I'll tell my friends have always said, hey, all these single men, you're a divorce attorney. Why don't you set me up? And I'm like, or at a difficult time in their life. This is not when you want to meet a man. But I also know they feel things. Everybody feels things very intensely. But I also have seen the effects, and I've really had to think about it as I've prepared for this episode of how much that hinders men in the process of healing from what's happening in their lives with this particular change, or
Yeah.
any change. They don't have anything to help them, and women have, their friends and
Right.
their, everything.
Yeah. And what's interesting, Susan? I have a lot of people who write me on Instagram and in my private groups frustrated that their partners meet, and this is heterosexual couples, um, women very quickly after the relationship. And I often say, do you know what it's like to be a man with not a coffee clutch of friends, not being taught how to reach out to friends, not being told to be vulnerable to friends, not knowing that it's okay to reach out to therapy? Like, having another partner might be the only other person who they can be emotionally vulnerable with. It might not be that they're trying to fully replace you. And sometimes that really shocks them.
Oh, I bet all the time it really shocks them. And I, that you say that. So there's another guest I have coming on soon is Daniel Harold, who is one of the people behind Divorced After 40 on Instagram. And he caught my attention because he put, as a divorced dad, an extremely vulnerable post out on Instagram, and it completely grabbed. Now, first off, I think that tells you everything because it grabbed my attention.
Mhm.
But what we're going to be talking about is this Divorced After 40 that they've created. He and two other, it happens to be divorced women, but they've created sort of a social group for people who are going through divorce because of exactly what you just said. He said, Susan, especially over 40, and especially if you're male, what do you have as a support system of friends and people who understand or that you can even talk about this sort of thing
It
with?
absolutely. And it's because of that toxic masculinity that men aren't encouraged to have that kind of network. And by the way, we know what happens if you meet, often stereotypically, if you meet a man who has a lot of female friends, people don't like that. Why not? Why can't they also have female friends or male friends who are, but they're going to have more likely, if they want to be vulnerable, have female friends again because of the toxic masculinity. And I would really, I mean, I'm hopeful. We were talking earlier that the APA came out with techniques for therapists to work with boys and men because of toxic masculinity. And so I would really recommend, it's just like how we started shifting calling girls bossy to calling them assertive.
Right.
I promise you that this episode is going to be so profound for people if all you simply do is start noticing the implicit messages and explicit messages you are sending to men and boys.
Yeah.
So when you notice that your partner is getting emotional and you say, "Oh, you're such a crybaby," you'll notice, wait, maybe I should say, "Oh, I'm so glad you can express your emotions." Like, would you call a woman a crybaby? No.
No,
Right?
no. And you wouldn't say, "Oh, you're such a crybaby. Oh, I'm just teasing. Oh, I'm
Exactly.
just making fun," right? That's what we do.
Exactly.
But we're not. We're just reinforcing that
That
stereotype.
message.
Yep.
Exactly. So to think about the next time you see someone in your life being vulnerable who's a man, noticing it, rewarding it. The other day we had my husband we thankfully our dog is fine, but we thought he was hit by a car. So it was very upsetting. And once we knew he was okay, my husband came in, and like many people, once you know it's okay, he just started hysterically crying. And my 13-year-old said to me, "I'm so glad dad feels comfortable crying." And I said, "I hope dad cries every day in front
Yeah.
of you."
Isn't that amazing? I
Right.
love that.
Yeah, that she knew, and because she felt, I could tell that she was like, "What? Ooh, dad's crying. This is a little," because she grew up in this world too. But then she said, "Oh, I'm so glad he could cry." And think about how that was for my son who saw his father cry. So, Mark, like, keep feeling your feelings. That is so deeply helping your kids, and get the support that you need. Don't feel like it's a problem to be vulnerable. And it is real. And there are men out there who are, it's, you have to dig for them, but there are men who are vulnerable. And it's cool. Susan, you were talking to me, you can tell me the name of the athlete, but when athletes do it, it's so awesome, right? Because they are so quintessentially masculine and vulnerable. So you can be
Yep.
both. It's the golden and.
Isn't that, and for oh well, I love the golden ants, but that I found an article from Wade Davis, who's a former NFL player, right? Totally macho world of professional athletes, and he actually it goes out and speaks to men in large corporations, these Google, Netflix, and the NFL. He's actually done this to his former colleagues, had this
Wow.
talk, and he talks about how to message, how to deal with toxic masculinity. And he very much says this is not the work of women. This is the work of men for other men. And that's why he, big, strong football player goes out and has those talks. And that's why Daniel Harold, that I'm going to have on the show, that's why he put that post out. He said the two reasons he did it were, one, he wanted his daughters to know how much he loved them and their mom, even though he and their mom weren't together anymore. And he wanted other men to know that it was okay to feel that way and put that out there. And
Mhm.
another friend of ours, Ben Heldfond, one of the authors of Our Happy Divorce, I happen to know that Ben will just get on the phone and talk with other men who need someone to talk to. Ben,
Yes.
I'm sorry I just put that out there, but feel free, reach out to him at Our
Yeah.
Happy Divorce on Instagram. Ben is, and he does it because he wants other men to know it's okay to feel, it's okay to be vulnerable, it's okay, because that's
Exactly.
how you're going to heal and get through this.
And it feels important, Susan, to notice that, to mention that, is this even, and I don't know Mark's background, but this is even more toxic for Black and brown men and men of color. And one of the things I started doing for myself, I live in New York City, was actually looking for images of men being vulnerable, but specifically men of color being vulnerable, to counter the images we see in the media. And so I know there's a few Instagram feeds too. Like there's one called I can't remember exactly. I can try to link it, but really to try to get those images out of, and just think, right? All we need to see is two men hugging each other, and how different that would be than two men, fist bumping. Well, not hugging during COVID, but
Yeah, right.
you know
I
what I
thought that
mean.
when you said it, but I do know what you mean.
Yeah.
Because we're not, it's so funny because I saw, oh, I told you. So my husband and I have been on a Queer Eye binge watching lately. And last night, the episode that we watched happened to be in a small town in, I think it was Nebraska or at Minnesota, Nebraska, but in the Midwest here where I am, where there might be, it's sometimes a higher level of that masculine stereotype at times.
Mhm.
And, they went in, and the gentleman that they were there to help said something like, well, I've never had a gay person in my home, let alone 5 gay men. And all these men were coming up to hug him. And the first one, you could see, man hugging him. It was awkward. By the 5th man hugging him, he was all in on that hug. And
Yeah.
it's even that men don't hug other men.
Right.
I
Right.
I, I realized it because I knew we were doing this episode, and I was watching the episode. I'm like, men don't hug other men.
Right.
We hug all the time.
All
You
the
and I haven't
time.
met yet, but
Oh,
I
I'm
hug
hugging
you
you
in the
across
street.
all
Yeah,
the time. Right.
yeah,
Let alone like when you sit with your girlfriend and you're like holding hands, talking, just like touching each other. Right.
exactly.
That there's this need for physical touch as well. And again, that goes back to like the man finding a new partner right away. I mean, who are they hugging? You know?
Right,
And
right.
so I think there's this deprivation of emotional output that we put men through, that is so incredibly unfair.
It is, and it's hard for them. I mean, we've talked about it. It's truly hard for them alone to find help. And
Yeah.
I know one of the things that you did, I mean, certainly they can go to a therapist and talk to a
But you know
therapist,
that the
which,
rates are much more that women, I think it's 60-20 or something, that men, 60% of a practice is usually women, where
oh, yeah.
20,
Well, that's what
40%.
it's not okay to reach out for help. It's not
Yeah.
okay to get mental health
Right.
help or
And also, if you get mental health help, this is what I've noticed, it has to be about your career. It can't be about your relationships.
right. Well, and that's just more of it, right? That's just
Yes.
taking it. It's okay for a man to be focused and driven in his career. It's not okay for a man to be focused and driven on his family, or focused and driven on finding a relationship that works for him, or like our friend Bella Gandhi, who does,
Mhm.
the dating. Well, she pretty much is the queen of dating for everyone. I think something like 95% of her clients are women. it's not that she won't help men. It's just men aren't going to go and get that type of assistance. And she
Right.
goes in there and clears out the head trash too. She'd probably be great with helping men deal with this issue, but it's not
Yeah.
where they're going, you know?
Right. Right.
So, but you did find a couple of programs that are geared toward men.
Yes. So there's one program called the Everyman program, which, and then there's a really beautiful one called the Mankind Project. So
Well, I
those
love
are,
the name.
yeah.
That's a
So those are
great name.
programs where people talk about, in general, about men being vulnerable. I recommend people follow Jason Rosario, who's a Black man who talks about the importance of being with other Black men, talking about emotional vulnerability. And I really encourage you to dig for this, Mark. I mean, it's not going to be the first, you know, page of Google, but you will find places and men who are doing this work. It's just not as prominent as the people who are working with women.
Yeah. Well, and again, to be fair, it's not, I don't think that people don't want to help men. As I said, Kate has tried to put out
Yeah.
programs and has done outreach to men. And unfortunately, I think is just a cycle of the toxic masculinity. Most men are not willing to reach out. And one thing, Mark, you may want to do is follow Daniel Harrod's group,
Yep.
Divorced After 40. I'm going to put all of these things that we're talking about in the show notes for everyone, but they do post. And one of the things that they're doing is they're in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And they do literal meetups where it's not dating. This is not intended to go and meet your next, Mr. or Mrs. It is intended so that you can get together and have some friends who are going through or have gone through something similar with the divorce and who want to get together and have friends who understand and who they can hang out with, have a drink with, or they go hiking, they go and they do things together. And he said, it's given him community, because when you get divorced, the other thing that happens for people is all your friends are your wife's friends,
Mm-hmm.
and that kind of goes away. All your married friends don't want to hang out with the unmarried, and the
Mm-hmm.
guy is actually the one who is generally ostracized a little bit more, or just sort of left. Well, he doesn't need Mary, she's so upset, she's crying, we're gonna
Mm-hmm.
call her up and take her out to dinner. They don't do that for Bill.
Right. You're absolutely right. And I want to just say to Mark and all the men out there that this is going to feel uncomfortable. You're changing a long pattern of behavior. And so just so you know,
Centuries,
yeah,
centuries and centuries.
exactly. Exactly. So you do not have to be, opening your whole heart on the first step on Instagram. I always talk about this, small little steps. That is how we shift and change a behavior. So even just the next time you're returning a text to your ex or to your kids, maybe you're with your kids, you say, I'm thinking of you. I've worked with men on missing. It's so interesting, Susan. Some men I've worked with, they're like, what is missing? What do you mean missing somebody? And I said, well, what do you feel when they're not there? Oh, well, I guess I wish sometimes they were there. That's missing. But they weren't taught, they didn't have girlfriends saying, I miss you, like we did 100 when we were all the time. And
Right.
so just that small little thing, add I miss you to a text. Just see how that feels to be just that little bit of vulnerable.
Yeah, well, I love that, by the way. Just adding that little bit of vulnerable. Think about that in that moment, or when something touches you, or you have an emotion. Feel free to tell someone about it.
Yes. And us women need to be able to tolerate that and not say, what do you mean? Trust me, I'm a therapist. And when my husband comes to me with vulnerability, my first reaction is like, what? Get over it.
Shake it off.
Shake
That
it.
was my
Exactly.
dad's.
I mean, it's just because of that's how, and then I think, oh no, he's a person. I always think, how would I want someone to approach me?
Well,
That's
that's
what I
another
think.
great tip. That's another great tip. Try a little touch of vulnerability, let it out a little bit, and think about how you would want someone else to treat you. Some great tips, because this is not going to be something that's easy to change for women. As you just said, it is not going to, I think an interesting phenomenon because we rail against the patriarchy in so many ways for good reason. But I'll tell you, when something needs fixing around the house, or when the garbage needs to go out, or when the dog, takes poop in the corner and I don't want to go pick it up, those are man jobs. And I go tell my husband that those are man jobs. So I'll fall back on,
Yeah.
the male female stereotypes when it suits me. And I'm going to out myself on that. That's, forget it. That's
Yeah.
part of
Exactly. And you know what, Susan? We could even say, and I've heard this said, I think before, that toxic masculinity is how patriarchy hurts men, because patriarchy is saying that all the power needs to be in this one homogenous way.
Yep.
And men are not that either.
Right. And they don't get a chance to be anything else.
Correct.
I mean, this particular issue, it really goes to the place where I see this, I think most, predominantly in a divorce situation, when we have a heterosexual mom and dad, is when it comes to the parenting, because that's so often where people will fall back to the gender stereotypes and expect that that's what's appropriate. And if a man steps up and really truly wants to, have that equal parenting and the experience of being the nurturer, as you used, I love that you used that word earlier because it's so evocative. They're not given the opportunity, and women don't give them the opportunity in the same way. I deal with female clients and mothers all the time who are essentially, I'm the mother, therefore I'm the parent, and that's collateral. He's collateral.
Exactly. Exactly. Think about, I want everyone to just take a minute and just notice what happens when I say, oh, the mom is a stay-at-home mom, right? You're like, oh, okay. I know that. Now notice what happens when I say he's a stay-at-home dad.
Yep.
Totally different.
Ding, 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 ding.
Exactly.
We have a winner.
So he couldn't get a job. He could, right? All these things. Right? Exactly.
Yep. Well, and the other flip of that is Susan Eckstein that I had on my show, who is a non-custodial mother. What's the first thing you think about her? What's wrong with her?
Exactly.
Yeah. So
exactly. And that's the toxic masculinity, and and the piece of the mother needs to be the nurturer, that we are so rigid in our thinking. And it's so, even those of us who are really open, we're so incredibly rigid. I remember sitting in a room, a support group, and a man who was probably in his 60s or 70s, I think he was in his 70s, started speaking and about his pain from his childhood. And I really thought to myself, what? This man is being, I was so shocked. But I am telling you, from sitting in those rooms and hearing men be vulnerable, it's the reason I was able to remarry a really, truly whole man who can be vulnerable. I would have continued to be attracted to people who couldn't express their emotions. So women, for better relationships, we want men to be vulnerable.
And that means we have to let them be.
Correct.
Right. So I think that, I'm looking at one of the articles I found from Dr. Axe. I'm not sure what we think of Dr. Axe, but he had actually some good points. And I just was sort of looking at, ways to deal with toxic masculinity. And I hope that this episode is actually doing some of these things, sharing facts about gender research, telling parents to be setting good examples and limiting use of harmful phrases or stereotypes in their homes, teachers discussing gender issues in classrooms, and public figures serving as a positive role model. I mean, we're talking about all these things. I think you have to talk about the issue, address it head on. I really think that Mark, to write that, and then when I reached out to him because I know how sensitive this is, and said, Mark, is it okay with you if I use your name in the episode? And he said, absolutely. And thank you. He told me how to pronounce it as well. But I really appreciate it, Mark, because, it really was the genesis for this episode, and it's really then what made Daniel's post on Instagram lead to my reaching out to him to ask him to come on the show. And I think that's going to be a very impactful episode in a lot of different ways, not just on this topic.
Yeah.
And it was something that you immediately, because I reached out to you right away, and you immediately jumped on as something that we needed to talk about. And I'm so glad we did. Is there one last tip that you can, sort of, or a thought that you can leave people with on this topic?
Everything that we think we know about how people are supposed to act based on categories is made up. They are not real. So anytime you find yourself thinking, filling in the blank, men don't, women don't, people of color don't, fill in the blank, this Mad Libs, it's wrong. Everyone feels everything. Everyone feels everything at different times. The question is, do we allow them to express it?
That's pretty powerful. I'm just going to let it sit there. So thank you.
Thank you.